To our viewers around the world, welcome. I'm Bernard Shaw in New York City. This is a special interview with the President of the Republic of Cuba, Fidel Castro, who is here in New York attending the 50th anniversary special session of the United Nations. Mr. President, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me.
And for us.
Y para nosotros también.
Exactly 33 years ago to this day, President Kennedy announced on nationwide television and to the world that Soviet offensive missiles had been positioned in Cuba. The two nuclear powers were on the brink of war. Later, the missiles were withdrawn. If you had not allowed missiles in Cuba, would relations with the United States be different, better?
No.
No. Because the missiles were the result of the poor relations between the United States and Cuba. And following the missile crisis, detente started to gain ground between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the international political climate improved after that.
Writing in his autobiography, retired General Colin Powell repeats a conversation he had with a Soviet diplomat, Anatoly Dobrynin, in which Dobrynin told Powell, "You Americans pushed Fidel into our arms." My question is, were you pushed or did you walk?
Actually, it wasn't like that. No, we were not pushed. There were problems. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion. The other plans that were later brewed against Cuba. The dangers of an invasion, a direct invasion with conventional weapons by the American forces. And the elements that actually determine the possibility of the use of those missiles. Actually, there were other factors. I remember that we were reported of a conversation between Kennedy and Khrushchev. I think it was in Austria, where Kennedy spoke in terms that really raised doubts and made Khrushchev feel very worried. We were informed about that conversation between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And actually, the Soviets were alarmed since they were quite committed in supporting Cuba at that time already. Then, there was a mutual convenience it was mutually convenient for us to have what today is called a nuclear umbrella. In my view, for the Soviets, and that seen at a distance, it meant to improve their balance of power, their strategic balance of power with the United States. Under those circumstances, there was a visit by a Soviet delegation to Cuba, presided by Rashidov, who was the party secretary in Uzbekistan. He was an expert in agriculture. That was what was said, because he developed the production of cotton in the very cold weather of his region. And then he visited our country with the head of the Soviet missile division. Then when we spoke about the risks that Cuba would be running in accepting the presence of the missiles, Cuba would be running because of the bad relations with the United States, he asked me, what could they do? That's literally, what could they do to help us? Then I said that the only thing that could give a guarantee, an almost absolute guarantee against an American invasion would be for the United States to know that an invasion of Cuba would mean war with the Soviet Union. The United States had on more than one occasion declared that the invasion of any of its allies would give rise to a war. So the Soviets responded to me. How can we do that? How can we do that? How can we give you that assurance? And then at that moment, they said that concrete steps were required. So they suggested the installment of the missiles. On the other hand, we immediately understood that if we had an advantage, they would also have an advantage. So we said that we better wait, that they better wait, that we prefer to think it over. Then we had a meeting with all the leadership of the revolution. We analyzed the matter. We introduced a moral element in the analysis. If we expected the Soviets to fight for us in case we were attacked by the Americans, then it was our moral duty to run the risk in the interest of Soviet security. Therefore, our answer was yes, that we were willing to accept the missiles. That is exactly how it happened. That is exactly how I remember things to have happened. And afterward, the whole thing came over, you know. I can answer any other question you want on this.
I noticed you smiled when I mentioned General Powell's name. Would you like to see General Powell become President Powell of the United States?
Yes, but you did not explain to me what was it that Colin Powell talked over with Dobrynin. Well, you said that Powell had said that we had been pushed. I mean, that Dobrynin said that we had been pushed. I do not agree with that viewpoint. Because the facts were different. As I have explained to you, we were not pushed. So it shows that both Colin Powell and me have a good memory about the events. He remembers what he talked about with Dobrynin, and I remember what the Soviets spoke with us.
Okay, just to be clear, I was reporting by way of having read General Powell's book, what General Powell said, Ambassador Dobrynin said to him. Okay.
I'll explain that to you. In our country, and me personally, Colin Powell's book awakened great interest. I mean, historically speaking, I was interested to know what he would write, and also from the human point of view. As soon as his book was out, well, not the book, but a long interview, I think it was in Time magazine. An interview was reported, and then we had it translated, about 35 pages. We read it. And as soon as the first book was out, our interest section sent it over. And we had 46 interpreters working on it to have it translated. And in 4 days, we obtained a translation of Colin Powell's book. But I have not been able to read it as yet, because I have had meetings in Uruguay, Bariloche, Argentina, Colombia. But as soon as I'm free, I'm planning to read the 500 pages of Colin Powell's book. I'm interested in history, politics, and his thinking in general, of course.
Así que estoy entre los lectores.
So I'm on the readers. I am among the readers.
Hay que advertirle
But
a
of course,
Colin
Colin Powell must be said
que nosotros no vamos a imprimir su libro.
that we are not going to print his book.
Pero ya lo tenemos traducido.
We only had it translated into Spanish to be able to
Y es
read
la
it.
primera traducción al español.
And I think it is the first
Si
Spanish
él quiere, le
version.
prestamos los materiales.
If he wants, we can
Pueden servir de algo.
give him the materials.
Porque los libros tardan mucho tiempo
Because it takes too long to polish a book, you know,
en ser traducidos.
in a different language.
Y nosotros teníamos necesidad
And we really wanted
de conocer bien ese libro.
to know that book, to read that book.
Así que podré apreciar algunos de estos
So I will be able
detalles.
to read some of these details when I go through the book.
What would you think if he became a presidential candidate?
Me parecería una cosa muy
It
interesante.
would seem to me a very interesting thing,
Una cosa nueva
something new
en Estados
in the
Unidos.
United States.
Y haría aún más incierto
And
el
it would
cuadro
make
político.
the political scenario even more uncertain than it is at present.
Mr. President, your daughter,
Señor Presidente,
Alina Fernandez Revuelta, is in the streets of New York City denouncing you and your policies. As her father, how do you feel?
Como padre de Alina, ¿cómo se siente usted?
Bueno, mira, tú me haces una pregunta.
Look,
sobre
Bernie,
un tema de tipo
you have raised a
personal
question about a personal subject,
delicado.
a very delicate question.
Y a mí me parece que yo no debo
And it seems to me
debatir este tema
that I should not touch upon this subject
públicamente.
publicly.
No sería caballeroso.
I wouldn't be acting like a gentleman if I did. I don't think it is reasonable for me to go into that.
Sí, yo prefiero que tú me
So I prefer
excuses
for you to skip that
de no
question.
poder responder.
I apologize that I will not be able to answer it.
I understand and I respect your wishes.
Comprendo y respeto sus deseos.
Gracias.
Nada. I should have said that in English.
Debí haberlo dicho en inglés para que mi televidente no
Personal
entendiera.
contact and discussions with world leaders are important to you.
Conversaciones con los líderes internacionales son importantes para usted.
What would a meeting between you and President Clinton do for Cuban-United States relations?
¿Qué significado podría tener para las relaciones entre Cuba y Estados Unidos una conversación entre usted y el presidente Clinton?
Yo pienso que toda conversación
I think that every
con
talk,
espíritu constructivo
if it takes place in a constructive spirit,
es útil.
can be useful.
Pero
However,
considero muy difícil que
I
se
think it
pueda
is very difficult for something
en un tiempo
like that to take
relativamente
place
breve,
in a
por
relatively
ahora,
short period of time. I mean, for the time being, I don't think such a conversation
entre el presidente
between
Clinton y
President Clinton and myself
yo, dadas las circunstancias
is possible
políticas
due to the
actuales
political
de Estados Unidos,
circumstances
el periodo preelectoral,
and this pre-election
la
period
gran
in which,
polémica y la gran
and the great
pasión que hay en
controversy and the great
torno.
passion generated about Cuba,
Le deseo a
about the Cuban case. I wish Clinton
los mayores éxitos.
the best for him, the great
Ahora,
success.
por lo general, yo puedo
Now, in
conversar con
general,
los
I
presidentes
can
después
talk
que
to
dejaron
the
de ser
presidents
presidentes.
after they are no longer presidents, you know.
Pero cuando son presidentes,
But while they are
resulta muy
presidents,
difícil.
it is very difficult for me to talk with them.
Por eso pienso que por
That's why
ahora
I believe that for the time
no
being,
se produciría una conversación, pero estuve
such a
cerca de-
conversation would not take place.
Allí cuando hubo la foto,
We had that photo up today,
Clinton estaba allí.
and then Clinton was there. I was there too. He was looking at everybody in the hall,
Sonriente.
smiling.
Did your
Yo
eyes
estaba
meet?
entre el grupo.
Y sus ojos se cruzaron, sus miradas se cruzaron.
Fue rápido.
Yes, but it was a
Sin
quick
palabras.
thing.
Pero puedo considerar que
I can still
recibí
consider that I
un átomo
received an atom
de la mirada de
of President Clinton's sight when he looked at everybody I was in the crowd.
que era para todos allí.
So
Después pasamos cerca.
later we
otro,
passed nearby.
y también estuvo en la mesa.
He was sitting at a table near
Lo
the table
escuché.
where I was sitting. I listened to his speech. He made a toast.
Lo aplaudí
I applauded when he made his speech this morning,
cuando habló en el almuerzo,
also when he spoke at lunch,
por cuestiones de cortesía
out of courtesy, of course,
y también por algunos contenidos.
and also because of the content of some of the things he said.
Speaking of presidents who are no longer president, around the world, President Carter has helped to resolve conflicts in Haiti, North Korea, Africa, and elsewhere. Would you welcome President Carter becoming involved in establishing a new dialogue between Cuba and the United States?
Yo pienso sinceramente
I sincerely believe
que las actuales circunstancias
that the present circumstances
no son las más propicias
are not the most propitious
para una mediación.
for Mr. Carter to play that role between Cuba and the United States. I understand that President Carter is trying to do good things. He wants to strive for peace in the world. I know that he would also like to do something for the improvement of relations between the United States and Cuba. But I repeat, conditions are not propitious at this moment. And it seems to me that Carter's personality would be at risk in an effort which could prove useless. That's why we would prefer to keep in touch with them, to have some exchanges, but not to think about immediate and a mediation on short-term basis by Mr. Carter to improve relations between the United States and Cuba, taking into consideration that we are also at a moment where you are involved in a very complex and intensive campaign. I think we should protect Mr. Carter.
President Castro, American fugitive Robert Vesco is under arrest in Cuba. What will you do with him? And will you extradite him to the United States?
Debo decirte lo siguiente, está arrestado.
I should say the following: he is arrested because of his behavior, which breaks our laws. Some of his activities have been illegal, and they are in violation of our laws. Vesco arrived in Cuba when he had a serious health problem. And friends of ours from Costa Rica, important personalities from Costa Rica, a very important personality whose name I prefer not to mention, a very respectable person, asked us to provide medical care for Robert Vesco. And we acceded to that. He was given the medical treatment, he came out right. After that, it was necessary for him to have some further checkups. And it was in that way that Mr. Vesco arrived in Cuba. Later on, he requested to live in our country. With this background of having received medical care in Cuba, it was also the request of other friends of ours that we took his request into consideration, so we accepted it, provided that he accepted the laws of our country and he behaved accordingly. And that was how he lived for a number of years. However, from the very first moment, we gave instructions to our people not to enter into any kind of economic relations with Mr. Vesco. Any kind of business relations with him were forbidden. As far as I know, some people took advantage of his experience in business and asked him questions about some financial transactions or economic deals, but there were no economic dealings with them properly. However, Vesco tried to make contacts with industries, he tried to get involved in businesses in Cuba, and he started to conduct some activities which were really breaking the laws and violating the instructions that we had given him and we had given our people not to have him involved in any business with Cuba. So we decided to have him arrested and conduct a serious investigation on all of his activities in our country. Now then, you asked me whether we would be willing to extradite him to the United States. And I ask you why? Because there is no precedent that the United States has ever returned to Cuba any person, whatever the crimes those persons committed in Cuba. Hundreds of war criminals
se refugiaron en
took
Estados
refuge in
Unidos
the United States
después del triunfo de la
after the
revolución.
victory of the revolution in Cuba.
Gente que había matado a
People who had
miles de
killed thousands of Cubans
y que robaron
and
cientos
people
de
who
millones
stole
de pesos.
hundreds of millions of pesos.
Y jamás Estados Unidos
And the
devuelve
United States has never
a Cuba una de esas
returned any of those persons
personas.
to Cuba.
De manera que no existe ninguna
So
razón
there is
de
no reason
reciprocidad
of reciprocity for
para
us to
devolverlo, para entregarlo.
extradite that person.
Estados Unidos no tendría explicación, no tendría
There would be no explanation. It
justificación.
wouldn't be justifiable.
Así le puedo asegurar
I can assure you, though,
que a Vesco no se le permitirá ninguna
that Vesco will
violación
not be allowed
de las leyes
to
cubanas
incur in any violation of Cuban
y
laws,
que seremos estrictos
and that we
en
will
la
be very
aplicación de esas
strict
leyes.
in applying our laws to him.
Juicio
He will have a fair
público,
trial, an open public
de
trial,
acuerdo a todos los procedimientos.
and according to all the legal procedures.
If the United States returned to Cuba the
Si Estados
fugitives
Unidos
you want,
devolviera a Cuba
would
los
Cuba
fugitivos
send to the United States the fugitives the FBI and the Justice Department want? People who are charged with murder, air piracy, and other alleged crimes.
Bueno, nosotros los delitos de piratería aérea
Well,
hemos sancionado muy
the air
severamente.
piracy crimes, we have punished them very severely.
Largos años de prisión.
People have been sentenced to long
Iniciativa nuestra realmente.
prison sentences
Por
on our
ponerle
own
un
initiative
desorden
in order to prevent
podía crear
the disorders
tragedias.
created by these people and the tragedies they could bring about. We did not invent the air piracy. Air piracy was really invented against Cuba,
Y después se volvió
and it was
como un-
later
Pero fuimos
turned against
nosotros los que
this country.
resolvimos
But
el
we
problema.
were the ones who solved the
Cuando un día
problem.
incluso devolvimos,
When one day we even returned,
devolvimos
we returned
a 2 secuestradores
to the United States two
para que los
Cuban
juzgaran.
hijackers to be tried in the United States and sentenced here.
Eran 2 cubanos. que se
Those were two
fueron
Cubans who had taken refuge
Los
here
condenaron a 40
and
años
hijacked the
de
plane to go back to Cuba. They were sentenced to 40 years in jail in the United States, and never till now have their relatives been allowed to visit them in jail in the United States. On many occasions, we have asked the American authorities to allow those two people to serve their sentences in Cuba, but the United States authorities have never accepted that, not even out of humanitarian reasons. So we have taken that measure.
No existe un tratado
Now,
de
there is not an
extradición.
extradition treaty between the United
O
States
si
and
existió
Cuba.
hace muchos años,
If it
ha
existed
caducado,
many years ago, it is obsolete
Perdón,
now,
dejado de cumplirse.
since it has not been ratified and it has
Pero
not been
nosotros no tendríamos
observed.
objeción
But we would have no
en
objections
suscribir un
in
acuerdo de extradición.
signing such a treaty with the United States authorities.
If there were a reciprocity.
Si hubiera una reciprocidad.
Por supuesto.
Yes, of course.
No puede ser de otra forma.
It couldn't be otherwise.
In the United States Congress,
En el
there's a
Congreso
bill
de Estados
pending to
Unidos
tighten the economic embargo. Some of its provisions include a country buying Cuban sugar and molasses cannot resell them in the United States. The bill would try to blockade Cuban entry to world financial institutions, and there are other provisions. Your reaction?
¿Cómo reacciona usted a este proyecto de ley?
Muy bien. Muy tranquilo.
Very well, very quiet.
Estamos acostumbrados a todas estas
We are
cosas
used to all these sort of things, you know.
hace tiempo.
We have been used to that for some time.
Pero prohibirle a un
But to
norteamericano
prevent an American
consumir un caramelo que se haga con azúcar
from
cubana
eating a candy made up with Cuban sugar,
es privarlo de una de las mejores
that is
azúcares
depriving Americans from one of the best things, from one of the best sugars in the
Con la
world.
melaza se pueden hacer muchas cosas.
Many things can be produced with molasses,
Un excelente ron.
even an excellent rum.
Y tiene además virtudes curativas.
And it has other virtues as
Nos costó privar a los
medication.
norteamericanos de eso.
So the Americans are being deprived of that.
Y además nosotros tenemos más mercado
Also, we have more markets
que azúcar.
than sugar, so we would need to produce more sugar for the market
Un
anyway.
aspecto, desde luego,
Of course, there is
requiere
something
sacrificación,
in this with other implications.
aspecto moral.
There is a moral implication in this.
Y además el propósito de intimidar
And it is the purpose to intimidate people who try to do business with Cuba, to discourage trade with Cuba. That bill comprises other provisions like the Torricelli bill, like the Helms-Burton, which is an almost adopted bill. For the time being, I can assure you that the United States position has been rejected in the world, in Bariloche, in Cartagena, at the United Nations. This policy is being rejected by the rest of the world. Now, as a whole, the blockade has cost Cuba over $40 billion since it was set up. So there is a big debt that the U.S. has with Cuba.
Before we pause for a very brief break, one quick question. If you were locked in a room with Senators Jesse Helms, Bob Dole, and House Speaker Newt Gingrich, what would you tell them? What would you say to them?
No sé si fuman tabaco.
I don't know whether they smoke cigars.
No sé si toman ron.
I don't know whether they like rum.
No sé si son personas que les gusta
I don't know whether they are people
conversar.
who like to talk.
Pero bueno, yo
But
podría
I would certainly
empezar a
start by inviting them
probar los tabacos
to try a
cubanos,
Cuban cigar and to drink some Cuban rum.
Conversar amigablemente.
We could talk friendly,
Amigablemente, bueno, respetuosa.
at least respectfully.
Y discutir todo
And then
lo
we
que
could
quieran.
discuss anything that they would like to deal
Yo
with.
siento que nosotros tenemos la razón.
I feel that we are right,
Y no tenemos temor a discutir.
and we are not
con
afraid to discuss it with anyone.
Ahora habría que preguntarles
Now then,
a
we
ellos.
would have to ask them.
Ellos seguramente dirán.
I'm sure they would say no.
Jamás
We would never
discutirían
discuss
una palabra.
anything with Castro.
Tal vez digan eso.
Perhaps they say that.
Yo no tengo esos prejuicios.
I do not have those prejudices, you know.
Tengo una mentalidad más abierta.
I tend to be open-minded.
Y mire, en Naciones Unidas
And look at the
hay
United Nations,
países que piensan
countries that think
diferentes
differently
sobre muchos temas.
sit together,
Y sin embargo, allí se dialoga.
they talk.
Pero me pregunta mi actitud,
But you
¿qué les
ask me,
diría?
what would I say to them?
Primero que nada,
First of all,
tendría que comprobar
I would have to
que son
know
personas
that there are people
con las que se puede conversar.
that you can talk to.
Y entonces podría
And then
abordar
after that,
cualquier tema que yo
I would deal with any subject they would be
que fuera
interested
de
in.
interés.
Mr. President, we're going to
Señor
pause,
Presidente,
and when
vamos
we
a hacer una
return, I will ask you about executive orders signed by President Clinton intended to have further communications with your country. We'll be back with our live interview with the President of Cuba, Fidel Castro, in just a moment. Continuing our interview with President Fidel Castro of Cuba. President Clinton has signed an executive order to ease travel restrictions by Cuban Americans to Cuba, to ease restrictions on scholars, artists, and clergy members, to allow relief agencies and human rights groups to expand their work in Cuba, to allow Western Union to open up an office so that money transfers from the United States to Cuba can be enhanced. And the President has signed an executive order which would permit United States news agencies to open bureaus in Cuba. And if you were to permit that, Cuban news agencies would be able to open bureaus in the United States. Will you permit this?
¿Permitiría usted que eso sucediera?
Me pregunta sobre todo lo anterior.
Are you asking about the whole question or just the last part of it?
Well, I don't want to seem as if I have a personal vested interest in the
Bueno,
news
no
bureaus.
quiero que
Of course,
parezca que yo
we
tengo
at
un
CNN
interés
and other
especial
news
con los medios de
agencies
difusión masiva,
want
con las
to be
agencias de
in Cuba,
noticias.
but the thrust of the President's executive order, every aspect.
Esa orden ejecutiva, Bernard,
That executive order
no está totalmente clara.
is not very clear.
Todavía
It's not
no se
absolutely
entiende
clear for us, not yet.
bien, porque dice que en
Because
circunstancias
it says that
extremas y de
In
emergencia,
the case of extreme emergency
se permitiría a
conditions,
los cubanos visitar
Cubans would be allowed to visit their
Cuba,
relatives
los
in
cubanos
Cuba,
o los
Cuban
cubanos
Americans,
residentes que viven en Estados Unidos, residentes aquí.
or people who live here.
¿Qué se entiende por situación?
What do you understand by situations of extreme emergency?
Bueno, es una abuela que está a punto de morir.
Is that a grandmother who's about to die? Is that an emergency situation?
Es una madre que tiene un cáncer.
It is a mother who's dying of a terminal disease?
O es un hombre que quiere ver una
Or is
pareja.
it a man who wants to visit his girlfriend?
O un novio que quiere ver una novia.
Or a sweetheart who wants to visit his love?
Yo entiendo que desde el punto
Because
de
I
vista
understand it from the human point of view,
si alguien tiene una novia,
if someone has a girlfriend in Cuba,
no debieran darle permiso una vez al
he
año
would not
para
be
ver
given
una novia.
permission to visit her only once a year.
Esas no son las mejores condiciones
Those
para
are
el
not the best
desarrollo
of conditions for the development
de un romance.
of a love affair.
Así que, ¿qué se entiende?
So what do you
Para mí,
understand by an extremely,
la visita a la novia está dentro de
for
las
a situation which
circunstancias
is of extreme emergency? For me to
extremas
visit
de
a girlfriend
emergencia.
is also an extreme emergency situation.
No se comprende bien
So it is
todo
not
eso. Para
clearly
nosotros no está
understood.
claro
For us, it is not clear yet what,
sobre esa orden ejecutiva.
what that executive order comprises.
Ha establecido la
It
posibilidad de
has
que la
set the
Western
possibility
Union
for the Western Union
pueda actuar para
to
remitir dinero a Cuba.
send money to Cuba.
Pero fíjate que los cubanos
But
son
look that the
los únicos
Cubans are the only ones. The
residentes
Cuban
de
Americans
Estados
are the only residents in the United States
a los cuales se les
who are
prohíbe
not allowed
visitar a
to
sus
visit their relatives
en condiciones normales.
under normal
A
circumstances.
los únicos a los que se les
The
impide
only
ayudar a la familia
Immigrants who are not allowed to help their families.
en condiciones normales. Es una verdadera
It is really
discriminación.
a discrimination against the
Tú sabes
Cuban
que existe la
immigrants.
ley Torricelli,
You know that the Torricelli Act exists
el llamado carril 2
and
de
the
la ley
so-called Track
Torricelli.
2, Torricelli Act
Públicamente
Track
se
2.
ha dicho
Publicly, it has been
que
said
hay dos formas de
that there are
destruir
two
la
ways to
revolución.
destroy the revolution.
Una a través de la
One
ley
is through
Torricelli
the Torricelli Act
y otra a
and the
través
other one
de la ley
through the Helms-Burton Act
Pero la ley Torricelli estuvo.
or bill. But the
La
Torricelli
ley
Act is
Torricelli
tough. It's really tough on
ley
Cuba.
dura.
It
Y
is a tough
Clinton
law.
declaró
And Clinton has
que
declared
se proponía reforzar
that he
el
intended to
bloqueo.
reinforce the blockade against Cuba.
Por eso es un tipo de declaración
But that's a kind of
que para nosotros
statement
no está totalmente
that is not very clear
clara.
to us.
Quieren intercambio.
They want exchanges.
Claro, nos quieren enviar
Of course, they want to send
sociólogos,
sociologists,
filósofos,
philosophers,
políticos.
politicians.
Sin embargo, no quieren enviar
However, they don't want to
expertos
send
en
to us
computación,
experts in computers,
matemáticas,
mathematicians,
biotecnología,
experts in biotechnology,
ciencias exactas o de
experts in sciences,
o actas para las
exact sciences or
investigaciones.
research.
Quieren un intercambio
I mean, they want
desigual.
an unequal exchange, we
De
could say,
ideas.
an unequal exchange of ideas.
Nosotros no tenemos muchos académicos
We
que
do not
enviar,
have many scholars to send to the United States,
ni muchos científicos,
nor do we have many
pero
scientists,
sobre todo en lo de la prensa.
but mainly in what regards to press.
En realidad,
Actually,
a Cuba han ido todos los periodistas que han querido.
every journalist who has wanted has gone to Cuba.
Cientos y cientos
Hundreds
de
and
periodistas
hundreds
han
of
estado allí.
journalists from the United States have gone to Cuba.
Todo el problema del éxodo masivo y de los balseros
All the problem of the massive
fue
exodus and the
transmitido por
rafters
todas las agencias
was
de televisión,
broadcast by all
por
the
todas las
TV
televisiones que
stations,
quisieron ir a
different
Cuba y
channels,
transmitir
all the
al
journalists who
mundo
wanted
entero.
to go to
No
Cuba,
pusimos
they broadcasted to the whole
ningún
world.
obstáculo.
We did not set any obstacles
Dimos
for them to
permiso.
cover the news.
Ahora, ¿qué sentido
Now
tiene
then, what sense does it make
que ya se pueden crear buros
to open
y que nosotros podemos hacer lo mismo?
bureaus here and that we can do the same?
Por cada 100 buros que se creen en Cuba,
For every 100 bureaus, news agency bureaus that
nosotros
you
no
open in
podríamos
Cuba,
crear ni uno
we
en
wouldn't be
Estados
able to
Unidos,
open one in the United States
porque no tenemos recursos,
because we don't have resources to do that.
no tenemos dinero.
We don't have the money to do that.
Sería un intercambio desigual
It would be
de
an unequal
información.
exchange in information.
Y
Again,
desde Cuba se podrían entonces
then
recoger todas las noticias
you would be
habidas
able
por
to
haber,
collect all the news from
con un
Cuba
enfoque
with any
de
approach,
parte, por parte de la prensa
with any approach on the part of the foreign
y
press.
nosotros no podíamos
While we
hacer
wouldn't be able to do the same thing because we wouldn't be able to have
Hay una
resources
situación
and open
desigual.
bureaus anywhere.
Nosotros
So there is
preferimos
an unequal
realmente
situation. We really
los
prefer
acuerdos bilaterales.
to have bilateral agreements.
con las empresas norteamericanas,
with the American firms, with the American companies,
en vez de un acuerdo de
instead of that kind of an
en
agreement.
estos momentos,
At this point
en
in
estas
time,
condiciones,
under the present
en que para
circumstances,
nosotros las cosas no están muy claras.
when things are not so clear for us.
President Castro, what are United States businessmen telling you about their desires to do business in Cuba?
¿Qué pienso?
¿Qué le dicen a usted los hombres de negocios norteamericanos acerca de los deseos que tienen de hacer negocios con Cuba?
Bueno, los hombres de negocio norteamericanos,
Well, the American businessmen,
yo he podido observar,
I have been able
conversado con
to
muchos de ellos,
observe, because I have talked to many of them,
están en contra
they seem to be against
del bloqueo.
the blockade,
Nosotros llamamos bloqueo,
which we call blockade, you call it embargo.
embargo, pero esto es mucho más que embargo.
But this is much more than an embargo. That's why we call it a blockade. This is an economic war.
Una guerra económica
This is an economic war against our country.
contra Cuba, pero ellos no están de acuerdo.
But they do not seem to agree with that.
Primero porque les duele
First, because it hurts them,
que tienen
that they
posibilidades
have the possibility,
económicas,
that there is the
comerciales,
potential for them to develop an economic
y que se les
relationship,
prohíbe
and that they are being prevented to do so. They are being prevented from getting involved in businesses with Cuba.
Segundo, porque son hombres de lucha
Secondly, because they are men who
y
like to
hombres de
strive.
competencia.
They are men who like competition.
Es igual que si tú eres
It is as if you
boxeador,
were a boxer,
o eres jugador
or
de
if you were
béisbol
a
o de
baseball
básquet.
player or a basketball
Y no
player,
te dejan
and you were not
competir.
allowed to compete.
Es un problema de moral, un
It's a
problema
moral
de
issue.
mentalidad.
It's a problem of
Y sufren
mentality, and they suffer, you
con
know,
que se les
when
prohíba
they see that they are
competir.
prevented from competing
Y
with
yo
the others.
noto,
And
realmente
I observe,
observo,
I really observe,
hoy más que nunca,
today more than ever
un
before,
fenómeno nuevo
a new phenomenon,
que es un gran
which
interés
is a great interest
en los hombres de
on the
empresa
part of the American businessmen
por las relaciones económicas
for
con
to
Cuba.
have economic relations with Cuba and for the possibilities to do business with Cuba.
If the economic embargo were lifted tomorrow, would there be new freedoms, political and otherwise, for the Cuban people?
En Cuba nosotros podemos hacer lo que soberanamente
Well, in Cuba we can do what
nuestro país decida.
our country decides to do based on our sovereign right to do it. Now, our position is that we do not accept conditionings of any kind
que puedan afectar la
which may
independencia,
affect the independence and the sovereignty of our
con vistas
country,
a resolver los
just
problemas
with
de
view
tipo
to solve
económico que existen
the
en
economic
Estados Unidos.
problems existing
O
between
los
the United
problemas
States and Cuba, or the political problems existing between the United States and
Y
Cuba.
esto es una vieja posición.
And this is an old position that we
Pero
have
nosotros
sustained.
sí te lo puedo asegurar
I can assure you
que no aceptaríamos
that we would not
condicionamiento.
accept any kind of political conditioning.
Recently, you met with opposition leader Eloy Gutierrez Minoyo. Are you considering allowing the formation of an opposition political party in Cuba?
Político de oposición en Cuba?
Por el momento no estamos pensando en
For the time being, we are not considering that. We are
What
not
do you mean
thinking.
when you say for the time being?
¿Qué quiere decir cuando usted dice por el momento?
Bueno, es verdad que ahora no estamos
That
pensando.
now we are not considering it.
No sé si mañana,
I don't know whether tomorrow,
dentro de 10 años,
or in
de
10
20,
years from now,
o de 100 años.
or whether in 100 years from now we would
Porque
be
realmente
considering it. Actually,
de acuerdo a nuestro pensamiento,
according to our way of thinking,
no es el multipartidismo.
we believe
que a
that
nuestro
the
país
multi-party system
conviene,
is not what is more convenient
porque
for our
nosotros
country
no
now,
podemos fragmentar
because we cannot divide our country.
a nuestro pueblo.
We cannot fragment our
Tenemos que
people.
mantenerlo unido.
We need to keep it united.
No podemos dividirlo en
We
mil
cannot divide it in 100
There are some
pieces.
people who argue
Pero hay
that
personas que argumentan
this solidarity
que esta
that you
solidaridad
treasure is
que
a
usted
form of
atesora
oppression.
es una forma de opresión.
¿Cuál?
Which one?
You say that political parties would
Usted
fracture
dice que
your
los partidos
country.
políticos
There are some
fragmentarían
Cubans
al
who
país.
say that is what Cuba needs.
Algunos dirían que eso no es justamente lo que necesita Cuba, fragmentarse.
Bueno, si nosotros nos hubiésemos fragmentado,
If we had fractured,
si nuestro pueblo se hubiese
if our people
fragmentado,
had divided before,
no habría podido resistir el golpe
it
que
wouldn't have been able to withstand
que significó
the
el
terrible blow
bloqueo de Estados
meant by
Unidos
the
en
United States
Cuba.
blockade on Cuba,
Ni habría podido
nor would it have been able
soportar la
to withstand
desaparición del campo
the
social.
collapse of the socialist
de la
camp and the demise of the Soviet Union. And this is in agreement with our tradition, because when the war for independence started, José Martí, our national hero, organized one party. But we do not have a party system to nominate people, to nominate candidates. You should understand that, because our party does not put up candidates for the elections. Our party does not elect people to elected positions. The neighbors, the citizens directly put up their candidates. It would be too long to explain our system, but as I'm telling you, the citizens directly are the ones who put up their candidates. And the deputies at the municipality system, at the municipality level, are the ones who put up the candidates to the National Assembly. And the deputies to the National Assembly are the ones, they must be directly elected by the people, and they must obtain over 50% of the votes in order to be elected. And they are the ones who elect the council, the state council, and the president of the state council. In Cuba, we do not have a presidentialist system. President Clinton has much more power than I do. And in general, the Latin American presidents are more powerful than I am. As the president of the state council, I cannot appoint an ambassador. I cannot appoint a minister. I cannot appoint many officials who everywhere in the world are appointed by the president. They have to be elected by the state council. That's the reality. It's a collective.
President Castro, you are a student of history. You are a very imaginative thinker. You have made sacrifices before. Have you ever considered resigning for the economic good of your country?
Has anyone offered me? First, somebody would have to come up with an offer. And after that, well, I do not see how my resignation could help the economy of the country. What I have said is that I will always be willing to do for my country whatever is necessary. That I do not have personal ambitions. That I simply discharge my duties, the ones that have been imposed on me. I am not the one who have imposed these duties on myself, but rather life, the revolution itself has imposed this task on me. But I said before that we would not be willing to accept any condition, in any political conditions. And if I were to accept that idea, I would be accepting that in Cuba political changes could take place. Even the resignation of the leaders of the revolution could take place in exchange for the solution of economic problems. We are willing to give our life for our people, but we are not willing to sacrifice the independence of our country. We are not willing to sacrifice the sovereignty of our country. We are not willing to sacrifice our principles. If I were to accept that, that would be in contradiction with what I said before.
What will be next for Cuba after Fidel?
Después de Fidel, ¿qué pasará en Cuba? As I said to a group of friends yesterday who asked that same question, that is not my problem. That is the problem for the ones who come after me. The dead do not give their views. And the retired people, when they give their views, they are not paid any attention. That's the truth.
We are all mortal beings. One day, I will be dead, you will be dead.
Todos somos seres humanos, un día yo
How
moriré,
do
usted
you
también.
want to be remembered
¿Cómo
by
querría
the
usted
Cuban
ser
people
recordado por el pueblo cubano
and by the world?
y por el mundo?
¿No te parece que es un poco difícil hablar de un momento?
Don't you think it is a little bit too difficult to speak about oneself?
Ahora,
Now then,
no me dejo llevar por la vanidad
I do not let myself be guided by vanity,
de la gloria,
by glory,
ni del juicio
or
de la historia.
by the judgment of history.
Los hombres pasan,
Men pass away,
y de vez en cuando
and once in a while,
se les recuerda.
they are remembered.
Lo importante es que uno cumpla
The
su
important thing is for you to discharge your duty,
deber, libre su batalla.
to wage your battle.
Y yo tengo algunas
And
pruebas
I have some evidences
de que a pesar de toda
that
la
in spite
propaganda contra
of all the
Cuba,
propaganda against Cuba and against me personally, there are many people
en el mundo
in
que
the
aprecia.
world who appreciates Cuba.
Yo acabo de visitar
I have just visited
Uruguay.
Uruguay,
Estoy realmente asombrado
and I was really amazed
de los cientos de miles de
of the
personas
hundreds
que
of
me
thousands of
visitan.
people who welcomed me there.
That's
Casi
why
no
I
lo
asked the
comprendo.
question.
I could hardly understand it, you know.
Porque quizás
Some,
gracias a
why?
ustedes,
Before, perhaps thanks to you, Bernie.
que
Perhaps thanks to
me han hecho famoso,
America, because you have made me famous.
me han convertido en una especie de David,
Perhaps because you have turned me into a kind of David,
pero un David que lleva
but a David
35
who has
años
been
luchando
for
contra un
35
Goliat,
years fighting a Goliath,
que es cada vez más poderoso.
who turns to be more powerful.
Pero los sentimientos que yo pude apreciar,
But the sentiments that I could see in those people
he estado en otros lugares,
were very
en la
nice
conferencia
to us.
del
I've
Río
been
de
in other
Janeiro,
places, in the Rio
del
Conference,
medio ambiente.
in the ECHO Conference
Ellos
years
estaban
ago.
representantes de todo el mundo.
There were representatives
But
of all over
that
the
is why
world.
I asked the
Es
question.
justamente por eso que yo le
That's why I
preguntaba.
asked the
Y
question.
bueno, yo no tengo ninguna queja.
Well, I have no
Fueron
grievances,
tanta
really.
gente a saludarme.
So many people went to my
Fueron
feet to
tanta
say
gente
hello
los
to
que
me.
me
So
demostraron
many people
apoyo.
came to show their support.
Fui a Copenhague
I went to Copenhagen,
y pasó
and the
exactamente
same
igual.
thing happened.
Hablé hoy en Naciones Unidas
I addressed the United Nations National
y
Assembly
el pueblo
today,
norteamericano es testigo de lo que
General
ocurrió allí.
Assembly today, and everybody's been witness
No
to what
todo el
happened there.
mundo
Not everybody
tiene tan mala opinión de mí.
has such a bad opinion about me, you
A
know.
pesar de todo lo que
In
se ha
spite
dicho
of everything
contra
that
mí,
has
todo
been
lo que
said
se ha
about
hecho
me, in
contra
spite of everything that has been
mí. Y
done
como
against
ahora
me,
soy el único
and as
país,
nowadays I
el
am
único país
practically the only
contra
one
el que se
the only
concentra la
country
propaganda,
against which the propaganda is concentrated,
entonces tengo más mérito.
then I take more
Vea,
credit.
no se ataca la URSS.
Because the Soviet Union is not
No se
attacked
ataca
anymore.
China, no se
China is
ataca
not attacked
Vietnam,
anymore.
no se
Vietnam
ataca
is not under
Corea.
attack anymore. Korea
Se
is not
ataca
under
nada
attack
más que
anymore.
Cuba.
Only Cuba is under attack now.
Toda la campaña es
So all
contra
the campaign
Cuba.
against Cuba.
Y nunca Cuba ha tenido más amigos
And Cuba has
de
never had more friends than it
lo
has
que tiene
now.
ahora. Ahora, ¿por qué?
Now,
Que me lo
why
pregunto.
does that happen?
¿Por qué? ¿Será que
I
tenemos
wonder.
razón?
Perhaps because we are right.
¿Será que la gente
Perhaps
admira
because
nuestra
people
lucha?
tend to admire our struggle.
¿Será que la gente
Perhaps because
critica el
people
cruel
criticize
bloqueo
the cruel blockade
que se mantiene contra
which
nuestro país
has been imposed on our
y
country,
que mata
and it's still there,
hombres,
and which is
mujeres,
still in
niños,
men, women, and
adolescentes,
children,
como dije
youth
hoy,
and elders, as I said
tal
today,
como si se tratara de bombas atómicas
as noiseless atom bombs
silenciosas.
killing our people.
Los contemporáneos,
You know,
¿verdad?
Bernie,
No tienen tan mala opinión.
people tend not to have such a bad opinion about me.
Ahora, ¿cuál será la opinión
Now, what will
ulterior?
be the opinion of people in the future?
Eso
That
no debe ser fundamental para un hombre.
that should not be the essential thing for a
Para un
man.
hombre que lucha, para un
For a
hombre
man
que
who's
quiere cumplir
striving,
una
for a
tarea,
man who feels that he
que
has a
actúa de
task,
acuerdo con
who has a
determinados
mission,
principios.
somebody who's acting in accordance with certain principles.
Pero si la opinión es la que hoy tienen muchos,
But if the opinion is that one,
quizás la
what
opinión
we see in
futura
many
sea
people
buena
today,
también,
perhaps tomorrow they will
porque
not
nadie podrá
pass a
negar
bad judgment on me, because nobody
que
will be able
durante más de
to deny
35
that for
años
over 35 years
resistimos la presión,
we
el
resisted
hostigamiento
the
y las
pressure,
amenazas
the harassment, and the
de
threat
la potencia más poderosa
of the
del
most
mundo
powerful
y de la historia,
power in the world and the most
En lo
powerful
político,
country in history,
en lo
both
económico
politically, economically,
y en lo militar.
and militarily. We have
Hemos
resisted those
resistido la
pressures.
desaparición
We have
del campo
resisted
socialista
the collapse of the socialist
y la
camp
desaparición
and the
de la
demise of the Soviet Union.
La gente es capaz de admirar
People seem to be capable of
esos
admiring
méritos,
that,
capaz de admirar
those
esos
merits.
valores.
People seem to be capable of
no
appreciating
tendrían
that.
derecho a atribuirme a mí
I
esos méritos.
think I do not deserve
Pero
to be
sí
given
al
credit
pueblo
for that,
cubano.
but the Cuban people,
Y a
yes,
mí
the
lo que
Cuban
me
people should take
importa no
credit
es
for
lo que
that.
vayan a pensar de mí.
What I care is
Lo
not what the
digo
people think
sinceramente.
about me, and I tell you that
Sino de
sincerely.
la forma
I
en
don't
que
care what they
vayan a
think
juzgar
about
a
me.
nuestro
I
pueblo.
prefer to believe
Y
how
pienso
they're
que
going to
nuestro
judge my
pueblo
people, and I
es
think that
acreedor
my people
a una
deserve
alta consideración histórica.
high credit historically for what it has done.
Religion.
Religión.
When and where will you meet with Pope John Paul II?
¿Cuándo y dónde se reuniría usted con el Papa Juan Pablo II?
¿Cómo y cuándo? No te puedo responder.
When and how, I cannot answer that.
Realmente se ha hablado.
Actually, there have been talks.
No es un imposible.
It is not something impossible.
Y han sido ciertos factores
And
de
there
índole
have
político
been certain factors of a political nature
asociados a las relaciones
associated to relations,
nuestras con la alta jerarquía
associated to our relations with the Catholic hierarchy in Cuba, what has been having an influence one way or another
No queremos que la
on this
visita
possibility.
del
We do not think that the visit of the Pope
se pueda convertir en un
should
instrumento
become into an instrument
para fricciones,
to promote more frictions and contradictions
para conflictos entre
and conflicts between
la
the
Iglesia
Church,
católica,
between the
la
Catholic
alta
Church
jerarquía,
or the hierarchy of the
jerarquía
Catholic Church in
y la
Cuba
revolución.
and the
Ellos han hecho
revolution.
declaraciones duras,
They have made their tough statements.
las publican,
They publish their tough statements about
pero todo
the
eso ha sido
government,
manejado con mucho
but all
tacto,
that
con
has been
cuidado.
handled tactfully by
Sin
us.
embargo, ha sido un factor
However,
que
that has been a factor
ha obstaculizado
which
la
has
realización de la
jeopardized
visita del Papa a Cuba.
the possibility of a visit by the
Permítame
Pope to
añadir
Cuba.
que yo tengo una alta consideración,
But
una
I'd
alta
like to say
estima
that I hold
por el Papa,
the Pope in
Pablo II.
high esteem.
Es una de las figuras
I
más
think he's one of the most brilliant
que
personalities
ha tenido la Iglesia
that
en
the
los
Church
últimos siglos,
has had in the last few centuries.
con el cual coincido en muchas cosas,
There are many things in which we coincide, you
aunque
know.
no coincido en todas.
Though I do not agree with him in everything, I do agree with him in many things. He's a person that deserves our highest consideration and respect.
Mr. President, we are running out of time. I
Señor
have
Presidente,
10
se
more
nos acaba el
questions.
tiempo.
I will
Me
continue.
quedan 10
¿Puede
preguntas
continuar?
más, así que voy a seguir.
Yo trataré de ser
I
breve.
will try to be shorter in my answers.
Gracias.
Tú me obligas a hablar.
But you forced me to speak, you see.
The group, Human Rights Watch America, says that many of the meetings of the evangelical Christian movement, many of their meeting places have been shut down by your government. Does the evangelical Christian movement annoy or disturb you and your government? Do you view them as a threat?
¿Lo siente usted como una amenaza a los cristianos o el movimiento evangelista en Cuba? Porque algunas organizaciones de derechos humanos han dicho que es así.
No. Por el contrario, nosotros tenemos
No,
excelentes
quite the opposite. We have excellent relations
con las iglesias evangélicas.
with the evangelical churches.
Excelente.
Excellent relations,
Desde
really.
el principio de la revolución.
From the beginning of the revolution up to now.
Que realmente,
Because to tell the truth, the Catholic Church in our country was the church of the wealthy.
No había una sola iglesia
There
en el
was
campo.
not one Catholic church in the
Esa es la verdad
countryside.
histórica.
That is the historical truth.
Las iglesias protestantes
The Protestant
estaban más
churches, on the other
en los
hand, they were
sectores
closer to the popular sectors,
y tenían pastores en el campo,
and they had their pastors in the
vinculados a
countryside.
los sectores más humildes.
They were linked to the most,
cuando vino
to
la
the poor
revolución,
people.
Se desarrollaron
So when
muy
the
buenas
revolution
relaciones
came over, we developed good
con
relations with
toda la
them.
iglesia, con algunas
We developed good
excepciones.
relations with every church,
A veces hemos tenido
with few
dificultades, por
exceptions.
ejemplo, con los
Sometimes we have
testigos de
had
Jehová.
problems with the Jehovah Witnesses,
Por
for instance,
razones conocidas,
for
cuestiones del
well-known
servicio
reasons,
militar,
problems
la
of
bandera, los
not
símbolos.
swearing to the
Eso lo
flag,
tienen
not
otros países,
respecting the
pero
symbols of
incluso
the country.
nuestras relaciones con los testigos de Jehová.
But our relations,
En los
even with the
últimos
Jehovah
tiempos han
Witnesses, have
mejorado
been improving lately,
y son buenas las
and they are
relaciones
good relations.
con las iglesias evangélicas.
I miscalculated. I have less than a minute, so I'll ask you 2 questions very quickly.
Yo quería hacer
You're
dos
wearing a
preguntas.
civilian business suit more and more these days. Why?
Cada vez con más frecuencia lo vemos a usted vestido de traje. ¿Por qué?
Eso porque en Cartagena,
That's because in Cartagena,
en una reunión cumbre,
at a summit
nos
conference,
exigieron que teníamos
we were
que ir
asked to
vestidos
wear
de guayabera.
guayabera.
Y yo descubrí que no
And
tenía
then
una
I
guayabera.
discovered that I did not have a guayabera to wear because I had not been
Entonces
wearing them
tampoco
for
tenía
years.
traje.
Then I did not have a
Y
suit.
una familia amiga
Then a friendly family,
tenía una persona de esa familia que es
a person in that
diseñadora,
family is a designer, so
nos quiso obsequiar
she presented me with these suits.
con un traje. Diseñó
She designed the suits, and here I am wearing these business suits,
gratuitamente vestido
free
de
of charge.
no me siento mal. He hecho como Colin
I have
Powell,
done like Colin Powell. I'm out of the
vestido ahora de
uniform.
civil,
He's dressed now in plain clothes,
pero para los actos
but only for these kind of activities.
solemnes estos internacionales.
And lastly,
Y por último,
and muy rápido, por favor. The World Series underway, the Cleveland Indians, the Atlanta Braves.
la Serie Mundial
Your favorite team?
están los de Cleveland, el equipo de Cleveland y los Bravos de Atlanta. ¿Cuál es su favorito?
Y ojalá, quizás por mi amistad con
Perhaps
Tony,
because of my
los
friendship
Bravos
with
de
Ted
Atlanta.
Turner, the Atlanta Braves.
President
A lo
Castro.
mejor sería un equipo cubano.
Perhaps the Cuban team, if it were there.
President Castro, we
Presidente
thank you
Castro,
very, very
le
much
damos
for
las
joining us
gracias
for this
por estar
special
con nosotros,
one-hour interview.
Por esta hora especial de entrevista.
It was a pleasure.
Fue un placer.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
De nada. I'm Bernard Shaw
Soy
in New
Bernard
York.
Shaw.
CNN is your network for complete coverage around